Welcome to The Voice of Retail. I'm your host, Michael LeBlanc, and this podcast is brought to you in conjunction with Retail Council of Canada. First up in this episode, recorded live backstage in Toronto at the Art Gallery of Ontario before the launch of his brand new book, The Reinventionist Mindset, Learning to Love Change and the Human How of Doing It Brilliantly, the one and only Joe Jackman is my special guest for our feature interview. Next, I reconnect after too long with Rob Schmults, Executive Board at Mid-Ocean Partners Private Equity based in New York, formerly Senior Vice President of eCommerce and CRM at Talbots, Senior Executive at GSI Commerce, and Mckinsey Consultant. We talked to New York City on the sidewalk just outside a popular whiskey bar where Scott Silverman was hosting his annual eCommerce Leaders Party. But first, let's jump into my conversation with Joe, picking it up as he describes the days of his youth already walking the retail show floor.
Saturday mornings with my dad, not to the ball field, but to the stores and walk them. And
right.
Grew up in that whole environment and realized what a wonderful orchestration of stimulus and product, of course, and services and messaging and imagery and design that retail is, and really got the bug. Didn't realize it. Went on to design school and then began a career as a designer. And then eventually started to just gravitate towards retail, naturally. And then eventually, surprise, surprise, I realized, I guess it must have been all those years I spent in stores when I was a kid. Went on to become a creative director. Built with some partners a brand consultancy, which I ended up selling to my partners, and then joined Loblaw companies for about 2.5 years as an executive. Became the first executive vice president of marketing, and that was a really interesting time. It was actually career defining in the sense that my whole life had been consulting to retailers on their brands and positioning and their store design and packaging and such.
So if you're so smart, let's see you do it yourself kind of
That's right. Yeah, exactly. I liken those years to retail executive boot camp because I really wasn't trained to be an executive, and in that case, a large publicly traded company, and to co-own, not only a P&L with obviously my peers and my boss at the time, John Lederer, but to also own the execution all the way down through organizations, and that taught me a lot of lessons. So that was really the career path, love of retail, constant throughout all of that. And then when I left Loblaw, I thought, do I go back to brand consulting? I'd become very, very deep into developing strategies that drive creative solutions for business. And that led me not only to brand strategy and how to construct really smart, thoughtful programs, but also to important things like customer research and insight. And eventually to attaching that to business strategy and how to optimize business models. And certainly Loblaw was just a great, wonderful experience on that. But when I left Loblaw, I thought, I'm really not suited to be a corporate executive. I didn't have the patience for all the things that you have to really be good at and love to do.
Particularly an enterprise of that size, right?
Yeah, that's that scale. And I love the company. I still to this day do. And learned so much, but I thought I'm better able to add value on the outside as a partner. But I thought I'm not going to go back and create, at the time I thought the world doesn't need another brand consultancy or another advertising agency or a design firm, what have you. But what it did need, because the pace of change was really starting to shift, was a company I would have liked to have hired as an executive. And that is the synthesis of that customer insight and deep understanding of what customers not only care about on the surface, functionally, transactionally, but what they really care about as humans, which drives their choices and their relationships with brands. And then the whole world of business strategy, which lives primarily in management consulting. And then the world of creative, which I grew up in. And then finally, marketing broadly aimed at bringing things to life in real time across channels and customer experience and so on. And I would have loved to have like one go-to partner. Right. And I had about 5, from McKinsey on one hand and my former branding company and my agency and my digital firm and on and on and on.
Lots of handoffs. Lots of handoffs. Deep subject matter expertise, but lots of handoffs.
Yeah,
right?
Absolutely. And the net of that was the responsibility for connecting all the dots and making sure that there was cohesion coming out the end of the pipe was really on me and the
Sure.
people I work with internally. And so I really was excited about change. I got to thinking about, could I stand up a company that would be a great partner as businesses are transforming themselves? And what I discovered was that I had such an experience around change. Loblaw was being transformed as I was there, and that picked up pace. And the world needed to revisit long-held strategies because those strategies weren't yielding results anymore, particularly in retail. The world was changing really fast. There was lots of disruption. Customer expectations were changing. But even more importantly, the digital revolution had put tools in their hands that gave them this incredible control over who they bought from and what they bought and how they assessed value and on and on. So I stood up a company called Jackman Reinvention Inc. It was called something else before that, but I really got onto this idea of reinvention as taking what's there and what exists and creating the next most powerful, relevant version of it in a very, very rapid way. And that's why I needed all those disciplines I described under one roof.
Right. So you've had a front seat, if not been in the driver's seat, to watch retail evolve over the past number of years. So what lens do we look through to understand what's going on in modern retail today? I often say, and I've been saying for years, there is no retail apocalypse. There's a tremendous transformation happening, right? There's winners and there's losers. Overall, retail is strong. But transformation, both in scope and scale and pace, is fairly relentless and fairly significant. How do you look at what's happening today?
Well, I think there was two forces that really intersected some decade or so ago, roughly. The ongoing centuries-old journey of people learning how to buy and be really good at it, how to seek value, understand what was relevant for them, assess value for money, compare one retailer to another. And that, I believe that journey into this heightened level of consumerism that is a norm in our society today is at an all-time high. I think we're actually a community of professional shoppers now, and we in the industry have been part of that. We've been the educators. We've given customers more and more choice, and because of the competitive intensity, their choices become infinite. Well, that centuries-old, as I say, journey and building of competency, I know it sounds kind of strange, but this community of ninja consumers today, along comes technology, the second force, which puts in their hands these tools that enable them to have incredible choice at their fingertips, to be able to compare in real time and to decide not only what to buy through those means, technological means, digital platforms and such, but also to act as a community, to compare their thoughts and to really listen or begin to listen more to their peers, other consumers, as much as to brands and retailers. And so that's really caused everything to change. And that, of course, a lot of things come with that, the emergence of e-commerce. But the other thing that's changing is these very tightly defined barriers between what is a manufacturer, what is a wholesaler retailer, and what is the consumer world. Now consumers actually can be broadcasting. Right. You have a very successful podcast. Right. You are self-broadcasting. I can have an Instagram account and followed by tens of millions of people, and my voice suddenly counts as much as some brands does, and that's a really interesting dynamic. And I say the walls have kind of come down between, because there used to be a time when all manufacturers did was they made things, and if they were developed in the brand sense, they would also make sure that those brands were well positioned and packaged, and then handed off to retailers who sold them ultimately to the third party, the consumer. Well, that is completely blurred now. Direct to consumer is one of the fastest growing phenomenon in consumer marketing. And that's simply manufacturers saying, why do I have to sell through a middleman? And, that phenomenon. And now, the last stat I looked at, 2/3 of manufacturers are already engaged or planning to be selling direct to consumer, no retailers involved.
Right. This integration of the channel strategies that used to exist that I grew up with at companies like Black & Decker and Levi's, where it's like we just sell in. We put a lot of advertising to make sure the retailer knows they need to carry us and to drive sell-through. Really, our job is focused on just sell in, and then the rest kind of gets taken care of. Right?
Yeah, and the degree to which now consumers are so confident and equipped to engage in not only the experience of buying, but also the experience of shaping what it is that they get excited about. And even lines between, what was pop culture and what was, paid for media. Everything has just sort of become this interconnected ecosystem of inputs and outputs and engagement and experience. So that's what's really happening. But I liken it, I'm old enough to have lived through other moments in time when it felt like a retail apocalypse. I mean, if we think about the impact Amazon is having, and everyone's talking about that, it's not that dissimilar to what Walmart did to retail, back in the 80s and 90s.
And what Sears did in the 70s.
Absolutely. There was a time...
Sears was the world's largest retailer in 1978, I think. They were the world's largest retailer. Not tremendously long ago.
1% of the GDP of the American economy at its heyday. There's a great book actually called The Big Store, which is the story of Sears from its inception to its early days and peak. And it's too bad. You and I were having a conversation before about, do all brands have to fail? And my view as a reinventionist, self-professed, is no. The answer is no. Anything that exists and comes to, scale and success is only a reinvention away from continuing that success.
So these big retail brands can be brought back from the brink. There's not a point at which potentially that there's no turning back.
I don't believe so. I honestly believe there is not a brand, a company that cannot be returned to not what it was, but the next relevant, powerful version of itself. If you spend some time looking at what is the DNA of that business and that brand. What was it that caused it to be great in the first place? DNA, as I think about it, those embedded concepts within any business, they tend not to go out of fashion. It's the manifestation of them that goes out of fashion. The way they go to market, the way they stand up a value proposition or a customer experience around that. All of these things are in this fluid, motion. The difference between my dad's generation when he was at Sears, I wear his gold watch from his 25th anniversary, and today is that the cycle is just compressing. It used to be that strategy lasted a long time, and if it didn't, it wasn't really strategy. Well, today, everything is compressing. Brand life cycles, the tenure of executives.
I was going to say that this tenure of the average CMO in retail is not a decade.
Yeah, and business model life cycle, the time a business model is viable, is collapsing at a rate we've never seen before. And if you look at it, this is not a surprise. It's been coming for decades, but it's this cadence of beats around change that now are getting closer together. Right. Look at the Fortune 500 today. There's only 60 of those companies that made the cut since the late 50s, early 60s. That's an incredible rate of destruction. And my view is it's completely unnecessary.
Destruction and creation, right? Because you've seen entities come up out of nowhere, like an Amazon. I mean, Amazon's given 20 years to be where they were to where they are today. So it's this cycle of creation and destruction.
But here's the thing that we have a tendency as business leaders. We do a couple things. One is we like to keep a good thing going. And it costs money and energy to, reinvent and to figure out what the next act of a business is. Well, if there's risk attached to that, what do? We assess the risk of change. We don't assess as well or as deeply the risk of
not changing,
staying put.
Interesting.
And so what we do for all sorts of reasons, even reputational risk. What if I start to change this company, and I'm the guy at the helm that, at the moment it doesn't work? Well, I look at it and say, would you rather be the one who, had some bumps and had some failures along the way to try to figure out the next act of a company, or would you like to be the one that rode it off a cliff because you didn't change? Right? I would definitely take, what I see as the lesser risk of continually examining who are we today. To some degree, it's who have we always been, but how do we make sure that that's continually relevant? And reinvention, I think, or transformation, has a bad rap. It's seen as something that's episodic. It happens, maybe once every decade. And I say, no, that's absolutely the opposite of what it should be. It's a continual reevaluation.
Very iterative.
Yeah, absolutely. Who you are in the world today, what's changing around you, and how you have to evolve. And you mentioned, disruption. To me, it's almost insanity when I think about it. Who better to create the next version of you or your company than you?
Right.
Wouldn't it make sense that it be you? I've had a lot of exposure to leaders over the years who, have held on too long and then had to do a quick pivot. Others who were enlightened. I think of Greg Wasson at Walgreens. That business was not broken. It had simply run out of growth, and its next act wasn't clear. And Greg saying, rather, I'm going to hold on and try to prevent the inevitable and maybe, double down and keep doing what we've been doing, just do harder and more of it and see if that'll do the trick. No, he said, look, let's examine the fundamentals, including the strategy of this business. And by doing so, he got that business back to growth and gave it the next 15-year act. Right. It was in good to great. Jim Collins wrote about that company, and then suddenly it's in negative comp sales decline. Yikes. But they said, look, let's not hold on to the past. Let's just determine what makes sense for us and our customers today.
So you've written a book. Let's talk about the book. Tell me all about it. I love the format because it's this mix of strategy and philosophy and then case studies that kind of anchor in what you're talking about. So congratulations. It's a very readable, great format book.
Thank you.
But walk us through a little bit of the book and the format and a little bit of your vision when you pulled it together.
Thank you. Well, I'm smiling because you know that expression, imposter syndrome. So, I was being teased as I was speaking to some students recently, and they said, reinventionist, that, there isn't, you can't sort of Google that, and there's no sort of formal definition.
Closest is alchist, I guess.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
I
said I made it up. I mean, just, if that's the pinnacle of a career path, for me, it's, I got to invent a career that was an alchemy or a synthesis of a number of different things. But I wrote the book, and now I'm sort of the imposter author, first-time author. Can I write a book? Is it going to be anything that anyone will care to read? We'll see. It launches today, sort of official launch date, and then in stores January 28th, and online. But what I started to realize back when I was working on Duane Reade, regional drugstore chain, John Lederer had come from the president of Loblaw. He had left, he'd retired, and he was persuaded to come back and reinvent, a relatively small drugstore chain, just happened to be in the exciting city of New York. And he said, 100%, I'm in, I'm going to do that. Tapped me and a few others and said, let's go at this business and create the best urban drugstore in America and give it a future. And it didn't have one. It was really in trouble. And through that experience, and at the same time I was working on the other coast with another Canadian, Glenn Murphy, who had gone down and become chairman and CEO of Gap Inc., and I was helping him with Old Navy. And
then he went on to a Shoppers Drug Mart, didn't he?
He actually came from Shoppers.
Yep.
And he finished that spectacular reinvention. Yeah. And John had finished this incredible run at Loblaw, which was such a creative era in that company's history. And so I was working with these two, incredible transformational leaders, and both of them had become friends, and we're working on these two very different businesses. And what I noticed was that as good as we might be in finding customer insight to pin a strategy off of, hang a strategy on. And as much as we might get a tight strategy that leads to a transformational plan and get the capital aligned and board support and all the things that you would expect would happen, that the success factor that we became very keenly aware of was a human one. That organizations, and this also Collins has written a lot about, those folks that are on the bus and they're the early believers and those that aren't, and can actually stop change. And I was jotting down at various moments just ways of thinking and behaving that enabled people to get more excited and aligned on the future and leaning into it and really facing all manner of obstacles and just crashing through them. What was causing that? Was it the fact that they believed in the future, that they had some energy around being authors of the next act of a business, et cetera, et cetera? And it turned out to be about 8 principles or just simple ways of thinking and doing. And that 8 became 5, and then those 5 little paragraphs became 2 or 3 word distillations. And the book is a reveal of that. But rather than that being dry textbook stuff, I tell stories in the book. And I tell the stories not only of the reinventions that taught me those lessons and illustrate what they actually are and how they work, but also the ones that didn't work, the failures. And they were the hardest to write, of course. And the ones that I really did need to be careful and say, hey, look, I own the outcome as much or more than anyone else. But in those were incredibly valuable insights and lessons. And what it all boils down to, Michael, is we support that which we help create. That is a fundamental of human nature. If people believe that they are writing the script for the future, that they are engaged, that they're going to be sitting on a porch one day and telling the story, not only was I there, I was part of it, then it will happen. The odds of success will go way up.
It creates, in my experience, it creates a momentum that is unstoppable.
Absolutely.
Right? There's people in the organization that are doing something fundamentally different. I was part of launching Hudson's Bay's first eCommerce. 2000,
there you
right?
go. And I'm sure that was an energized time.
The world's oldest company. We're getting into e-commerce. We're crashing here and burning there and succeeding in different places. But it was this cultural momentum that we somehow created to get it done. Yeah,
and that's you hit on the one word that, if I'm obsessed about anything in the work that I do, it is that. Because what I learned was what it's like to, be co-leading a business or advising a business that has it as compared to one who doesn't.
Right.
And, what is momentum? It's critical mass times the speed with which that mass is moving. That's that's Newton's law. And that momentum has so much advantage. It tends to draw attention. It tends to bring people on. We actually chase that which is moving in front of us. It crashes through barriers. And there's so many. I think about culture in big organizations almost like the human body. Change is a foreign object that the white blood cells mobilize to try to kill. And I laughed in working with some American leadership teams. One of the executives said, "Joe, you are actually the foreign object. You're the Canadian, the change agent in the midst here." But there's a lot of reason, like not in my watch are you going to change this company. We've been successful 100 years. So getting ahead of that, moving faster than those white blood cells can mobilize against is part of it.
And it's my experience as well was it tends to create this gravitational pull that this momentum creates this gravitational pull, and then suddenly even in very old companies people want to be part of it.
Yes.
Right. And there's this thing that draws people into the project, right? Whether they they see it either as a career opportunity or just something really interesting going on in the business.
Yeah, and it is that I love that notion of gravity, because if you think about it as a big object moving through space, it has a gravitational pull. And what I learned in both Duane Reade in New York and Gap across America, Old Navy, was that kind of force changed the minds of all the people that mattered, the most important of which are customers, but also vendors. The willingness to kind of support and maybe go out on a limb, even media. And in a social media world, big objects that are moving fast, and it seems like there's excitement there, draw a lot of attention.
Right on.
So, creating that is not by chance. It can be engineered, and I talk about that.
You could be purposeful about it,
100%,
and this book is a guide to doing it.
In fact, the last principle is make momentum together, and I talk about how you actually do that.
So what's next? What's next for you and for your organization for 2020? I mean, if you had to define, I'm going to ask you the fun question. If I was to ask you a question, 2020 will be the year of blank in retail, and you and your organization, what would you say?
I would say it will be the year of momentum. And I say that because we have gone through a crisis in the retail industry. You know very well. You just came from NRF, and you talked with lots of people. There's always the new exciting ones, but even the Caspers and the Wayfarers and the Amazons, we see the wonderful growth. Just peek behind the curtain and look at the economics.
Unit economics still matters, I think.
Absolutely. And, it's one thing to be able to raise money, but, I would have loved to, when I owned a P&L, to be like, don't worry about the profit part. That's just,
don't worry about
that nasty business.
Let the accountants worry about that.
Yeah, exactly. So I think there is this artificial sense that disruption in the new model is, that's where all the real, certainly it's an exciting place to play. And I think there's lots of potential there, and there's certainly lots of growth there. Right now, that's still being worked out. I mean, just look at WeWork as a, unfortunately, it's the poster example of let's not get ahead of ourselves and confuse potential for what a business model is that is sustainable. But the reason I say momentum is that, in lots of ways, there's a return to confidence. I've worked with private equity for a long time, and I'll tell you the absolute death knell on retail was when the investment committee of a private equity firm I won't name says, Joe, we appreciate your perspective, but believe us, the last place we're going to put dollars these days is in retail. Too much change, too much carnage, too much uncertainty. Do we put it towards digital where no one makes any money? Do we put it towards bricks and mortar, which feels like yesterday's idea? And all of that is getting sorted out, just like it did back in the days of Sears when it's in its heyday, and Walmart we were talking about. And people are starting to realize, is there a role for stores? Hell yes. And it's incredibly exciting and robust. And stores make money. Stores make more money when they're attached to really robust channels. Right. Digital channels, e-com, social, and when you can get all those things rolling together in harmony and create the proposition that isn't functional but is emotional, experiential, that's the winning hand. And I think people can now see it, and there's enough evidence. It's funny, I'm on stages sometimes, and I'm certainly in a lot of boardrooms, and I'm asked, well, what's your recommendation if there's sort of one silver bullet to get out of this mess if you're a legacy retail, or to get on to something that's actually going to have a future sustainably? I'll say, stop selling products and services. Just stop doing that. The world doesn't need more products and services. Of course, that's how you're going to make your money, but sell something else that people care about more. And if you don't know what that is, then you better figure that out, because that's the key to sustainable growth and relevance.
It's great advice. Congratulations again on the book. I encourage everybody to read it. I'll put a link in the show notes.
Thank you. Very much appreciated.
Great to spend time. Thanks for spending time with the Voice of Retail, and have an amazing year ahead.
Thanks. You as well, Michael. Thanks. I appreciate it.
Rob, welcome to the Voice of Retail. How are you doing today?
I'm great, thanks. Good to see you.
Well, it's been a long time. I think the last time you and I saw each other, Joan Rivers was in the room, and at a shop.org event many years ago. So we're here together in New York at NRF. First of all, let's talk about your personal, professional background, and tell us a bit about yourself.
Okay, great. So I have been in the e-commerce space, sort of broadly defined, since the mid-'90s. So I guess I'm cheating a little bit because it would have been internet at that point rather than e-commerce.
Right.
But have been both a retailer, but also been a service provider to retailers. So as a consultant and also at companies that provide solutions. Just a couple of examples of places I've worked. GSI Commerce, which provide a lot of e-commerce solutions and platforms for brands. I'm sure your listeners will know, like like Ralph Lauren, NHL. Actually, we had to comply with the Quebecois requirements for the NHL, and then worked at Mckinsey for a bit, the management consulting firm. Again, just doing e-commerce. Was an executive at Talbots, which is a women's apparel brand. It sells in the U.S. and in Canada. Bunch of other things, but again, pretty much retail and e-commerce, which I just luckily there was no grand plan. I kind of found myself almost stumbled into it by accident, and it's just been great. And I like the fact that I've been both a retailer and a service provider, because I think when I'm on the service provider side, having been a retailer is a super valuable point of view to have, because I understand, kind of what they're facing, what their challenges are, sometimes how hard it can be to get things done, get things prioritized, resource limitations, what have you. And then flipping it around when I'm on the other side of the table and I'm buying solutions, it's not that I have a jaundiced eye, but I guess maybe I'm a more discerning purchaser a little bit. So I think that's been very helpful. And I've been lucky to just work with a lot of great teams over the years and a lot of great people.
Well, from that perspective, you know what questions to ask, which is half the battle when you're trying to find great vendors in your space, right? So speaking of vendors, we're at NRF. What have you seen what's popping out at you? What have you seen?
Well, can I riff on that last comment you made? Because I think it's super important. I think one of the mistakes that companies make over and over, and I know because I've made this mistake, is they'll come to a show like NRF or what have you, and they'll go around looking for solutions. And I think what you really need to do is start off with, what problem am I trying to solve? What opportunity am I going at? And then go find your means to that end versus the other way around. And I'm not saying that because I think you asked me that question. You didn't. But more just riffing on the point you made. I think if there's one thing I've learned, it's any vendor worth their salt, and this is the benefit of talking live from New York City, any vendor worth their salt is going to be able to get you excited about their solution, right? Wouldn't you like 2%, more sales? Wouldn't you like to see your, exactly? And you're like, wow, if I add that all up, I'll have infinite sales. But I think it's really, really important to come with the problem you're trying to solve and then go looking for the solution. So start with your end and then go look for the means. Anyway, back to your question. Sorry. One thing that I was really struck me is there's been what started as just sort of a glimmer on the horizon, and there was a little bit of this last year, and now this year it's kind of everywhere, are technologies that are empowering store associates. So the in-store experience, and most of them I think are doing it the right way, which is not getting between the associate and the consumer, right? It's not that the associate holds up an iPad and says, kind of talks from behind it. It's actually the other way around. The technology is enabling the associate to do a better job of, frankly, being a human in the store experience. And I don't know that this happened in Canada, but certainly in the U.S., what we saw over many decades was a real sort of devaluation of the associate as an asset, and they were viewed predominantly, not everywhere, but they were viewed predominantly as a cost center, right? So how do we wring costs out? How do we have fewer associates? How do we pay them less? How do we not have them, work so much, et cetera, et cetera.
Manage their hours, right?
Exactly. And then let's stick them behind a cash wrap and just have them sort of manage checkout. Now, if you think about what's the least value-added thing, it's like scanning the product and collecting the dollars. And so now what's happening is you're seeing more sort of the kind of data that we've gotten used to in the digital world, customer purchase history. Who is this customer? What are their preferences? What do they like? Product recommendations, list goes on, and putting that information in the hands of the associate so they can be a better associate and provide a better experience to the customer. And the reason why I think that's super important is people are asking, how are we going to reinvent the store? How is the store going to compete with online? That's how it's going to compete with online, is empowering that human interaction, that relationship. There are other ways too, which maybe I'll talk about in a second, but I think that's a really important trend that I've seen.
Well, one thing I hear from consistently in retailers from both Canada and the U.S. is store traffic, incremental store traffic is hard to come by. So let's turn our minds now more and more, I think you're absolutely right, more and more to how I get conversion up. First measure it, but really, I completely agree. It's how do I get a better in-store experience so that the folks who are in the store actually convert.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely right. And then there's another piece that I think, again, it's not explicitly tied to the store, but I think it manifests itself very importantly there, which is, so I had this experience in my career where place I was working, we got to the omni-channel promised land. So we were we got order from store, not just up and running, but it was humming, and we were seeing a high volume of demand coming through that. We had ship from store working, and it was a big volume of our e-commerce sales. And we were reserving. You could go on the website and reserve product and and that was a big volume of the store traffic. And then what we got very excited about. Look how much a business is flowing through this, and it was working as designed, as Scott we wanted. And then we realized, oh wait, this means we actually have the product in the wrong place a lot of the time, right? So if you think about
It's so interesting. That's such an interesting observation.
Yeah. Now, don't get me wrong. There are cases when you're doing ship from store and you're doing it on purpose. So you're treating your stores like a DC, and you've designed that into your system. That was not our case. And so what it meant when we shipped from store, again, we were thrilled to be capturing that demand, but it's much more expensive to ship from your store than from a warehouse, which is tuned and optimized. And
it's inefficient. It's inherently inefficient.
Inherently inefficient. And that inefficiency shows up in actual costs. And I don't know any retailers that are happy to give away margin, right? So we had this insight, we had this realization that oh my gosh, we're not doing a great job.
We're going to interrupt just once.
Yeah, it's a live.
Bill! It's Bill Bass! How's it going? Hey!
How's it going,
I'm good. How are you?
Dave Bolotsky.
And Dave Bolotsky. Say hi, Dave.
Hi, Dave.
Michael LeBlanc.
We're doing a live podcast.
This is what happens in New York City.
Sorry about
Just run into e-commerce experts. They're literally everywhere.
They're falling for the trees.
Hudson Bay's everywhere.
Hey, we're all everywhere. Good to see you, my friend.
Me too.
Everything good?
Things are good.
Fantastic. Well, we're just doing a quick podcast interview.
This is like the blue.
Yeah.
Sorry, we didn't mean to interrupt you. Like real
You should probably be interviewing these guys instead of me. But anyway, you're stuck with me.
He's on deck tomorrow. You're soon.
It's good. I love. We got a little quick dose of those guys in the middle of it. But we'll see if I can recover my train of thought.
We were talking about stores.
That's right. So you get to the omnichannel promised land, and you realize, wait, our products aren't quite where we need them to be, or where they optimally should be is a better way of saying it. And I think what's been really, really interesting is at this show, because you asked me what am I seeing at the show.
Yeah, what are you seeing? What are you seeing here?
I'm seeing that come up more and more, where, just to list a few, Belk and SaaS talking about this issue, Google Cloud, heard Salesforce, I think, talking about this. So you had a number of different folks talking about this fact of, hey, how can we apply particularly AI and ML, artificial intelligence and machine learning, to this problem of inventory allocation to try and do a better job of getting not just the product, but if you think about apparel, it's also the color and the size that the customer wants in the place they want it. And probably the place where that's most important is, again, in the physical store. Because if you've gone to the trouble to go to the store, one of the best ways you can come away feeling like you had a great experience is if you actually leave with the products that you wanted that are in your size and in the color you wanted, right? So I think there's not just an opportunity here to improve efficiency, take some costs out of the system, et cetera, but also to get people going like, I don't know what it is, but whenever I go to Hudson's Bay or wherever, when I go in there, they just always have my size and my color. And I do think that's, is that really achievable? It is. I think, at least on a probabilistic basis, that we can do a much better job of having a much higher likelihood of when Michael comes into the store of having his size, when Rob comes in the store having his size, whether it's Jill, Jane, whoever. And so I think that's something I heard people talking about more and more. And the interesting thing about it is the data's there, right? Because companies have these sales histories by store, in some cases, going back for, decades. So that data's there. It just needs to be pulled up and put in a system that can consume it. So that was another thing I saw that, again, I was probably looking for it a little bit, so there's probably some selection
selection bias,
right? Exactly. But that really struck me. And then I'll say the thing that has always interested me that's not here is marketing solutions. So if you think about how critical that is to drive demand and how many companies now see that, hey, I need to get, whether it's driving my online traffic or my store traffic, those solution providers tend not to be here. Now, I think they must have other conferences they go to, but it does feel to me, and I'm not making a pitch for NRF, but it does feel to me that those companies can and should be here, and especially given how we're seeing things like personalization move off-site, out onto the internet, how we're seeing store traffic increasingly start with, online marketing, how retargeting, people are starting to retarget store traffic online, et cetera, et cetera. So I think those solutions not only would add value to the retailers, but I think they would find value at being at the show. And I think, increasingly we're seeing this compression of marketing and site experience and store experience, et cetera. So it makes sense to me. I think there'll be some very interesting things happening when they start to show up here as well.
Well, it circles back to your whole point about arrive at a show like this, whether it's NRF or any other show, with a purpose.
Yes.
Right? And it does feel like a gap, I agree. You often see, operations, more operations focused. That's the history of the NRF show, but it's really these two things are merging. Let's talk about what you're doing right now.
Yeah.
Because you've been on the vendor side, you've been on the retailer side, now you're on a slightly different side. So tell us, in the last question, kind of tell us what you're doing now and what your focus is today.
Yeah, so I'm working with a private equity firm called Mid-Ocean Partners, and they focus on the mid-market. They do both brands that sell direct to consumer as well as business services. And I help the portfolio companies with digital, e-commerce, online marketing, et cetera. And then also, when we're looking at companies that Mid-Ocean's thinking of acquiring, I'll be there to help kind of, how are these guys doing in digital? What is the opportunity for them, et cetera, et cetera. So it's a really fun, you're right, it's kind of a combination because I get to sort of bring my solution provider I guess, to it in one sense of like, hey, how do we make maybe things work better here?
Or you can see what's absent from the platforms or from the vendors or from the retailers or whoever you're looking at is at the same time. And also an opportunity to see, I think I can move this business forward because I know enough about what's out there to move your business forward.
Well, yes on the first part, and the second part I'll change it a little bit, and I think this is where the fact that I've been an operator comes in. And you know this too as a former operator as well. There's nothing worse when some outsider shows up and is like, Michael, you need to synergize your platform with seamless integrations between, and you're like, thanks for the platitudes, buddy. I got more greetings from New York for your listeners. They're not honking at us in case anyone's worried. We're doing this on the street, but not in the street. And so I would like to think, and maybe you'll interview some of the folks that I'm lucky enough to work with, that because I've been an operator, I'm very respectful of the fact that they know more about the business that they're working in than I do. And so rather than it being my idea or my solution, I'm sort of trying to be a support function for them. And so as they're grappling with challenges, opportunities, et cetera, if I can help them, maybe I've seen something, maybe I know someone who's launched that particular feature or had to deal with that particular challenge, I can connect them. So I really try to do as best I can to adopt that stance rather than being the guy sort of levitating 3 feet off the floor, making lofty pronouncements and et cetera. Because, if one thing I've learned is I definitely don't know everything, and I shouldn't presume that I do. And probably the most way I can be helpful is by being a thought partner, not by trying to be a dictator of strategy or tell them you should do this or you should do that. So anyway.
Well, Rob, you're a triple threat operator. Been on the vendor side and now on the private equity side, so helping companies realize their potential. So listen, I want to thank you for being on the Voice of Retail. Great insights and hear from live on the streets of New York. And thanks so much. It's great to see you again.
Yeah, great to see you.
And great to catch up.
Well, and thank you for having me, and always a pleasure catching up with you. So yeah, really, really good to see you. And glad you're doing this. I think these, as you and I talked about earlier, these types of podcasts can be. I'm not saying what I said is necessarily helpful, but I'm sure your other guests provide a lot of wisdom and insight. And this is an industry where I think we all learn from each other, and no one's got a monopoly on what works. So yeah, I'm glad you're doing this. It's a service. I mean, it really is. So perfect. Thanks for having me.
Well, thanks so much, Joe and Rob, for being my guests in this episode. During the interview with Rob, I'm sure you heard some shenanigans going on as we ran into David Bolotsky and Bill Bass, two legendary e-commerce operators and entrepreneurs and retailers, and you'll be hearing from both of them later in the year on The Voice of Retail. Well, now let's hit the highlights from the retail news in Canada and around the world. Retail this week for the week of February 7th, 2020, kicking off with Canadian Tire. Canadian Tire's posted some great results this week, and as part of that, Greg Hicks talking about Canadian Tire expanding the in-store pickup program to support their growing e-commerce. And, when you go to some select, my local e-commerce store, there's this giant pickup tower that I think it's made in Estonia, actually, where it's a wonderful experience, really. I love it because you order your product, get it picked up in store, and then simply when you get your email confirmation with your phone, just hold the phone up against the kiosk and whiz bang, out comes your product and out the door you are. It's a wonderful pickup experience, best in class. So look forward to seeing that expanded, actually. So I think it's a real great solution. Other news, of course, the coronavirus out of China is really making news. And aside from all the political and the human costs beyond the scope of this podcast, what really is starting to resonate is the impact deep into supply chains. And I guess, I've described it as known unknowns. And by and large, these are very, very early days. We do know some things, however. We do know that trade show traffic is down significantly. Major trade show in Europe, not a retail show, was just canceled. And there's buying. I was talking to merchants today, retailers today, whose buyers are not going to China as they typically would this time of the year to do buying shows. So those costs are going to start to add up. And, when you talk to retailers, and I'm going to do some special interviews for next week, digging into this in more detail. And there's a couple articles actually in Retail This Week talking about this. Everything from assuming if and when manufacturing starts, whether you're buying your private label, how does that product get onto the ship, and is there a huge bottleneck which causes increased costs and delays there? And then retailers start to examine whether in their 90-day out, however long out their flyer programs, they start having to make decisions, purchase, PO by PO, as one of the retailers I talked to today. So it's a really, we're going to stay on top of this. It's going to be a big story. And we all hope, of course, resolution comes quick for a whole bunch of reasons. Of course, first and foremost, the safety of the people around the world, but also, we don't really need another element of uncertainty in retail business, and that's a global impact for sure. You've already seen, and a couple of articles that I included here, Canada Goose calling down their numbers because then you're starting to worry about demand. The Chinese customer is very important. Canada Goose, both in China with stores in China and here. Other brands, like some of the luxury brands, are worried or feeling that there's going to be impact there. So we're going to keep a close eye on the story as it evolves literally day by day and week by week. One of Canada's last Sunday shopping bans is coming to an end. Yes, it's true. In Manitoba, provincial law talks about no shopping, and as part of the Pallister government's re-election in late 2019, they ran on a platform that was, from that element, more retail-friendly, and they were going to allow the communities. This article, I was actually quoted in it, interview from and within the Globe and Mail, just talking about how Steinbach, Manitoba, is really not that keen on it. And I guess the interesting thing is that community values meets consumer demand meets leveling the playing field with other online retailers who, of course, are open, and with the government paving the way for different regions, municipalities, and districts to make their own decisions, and then retailers to make their own decisions about whether to stay open on Sunday. From the Vancouver Sun, empty storefront tax. Vancouver councillors look at retail vacancies, challenge for small business. We've talked about it in the podcast before. Great article from the Globe and Mail on. There's a lot of articles actually this week from the Globe and Mail as I kind of scan down it now. How data analytics transformed M&M food market. So good background there. From Retail in the World, Showfields. And of course, if you were listening to 2 episodes ago, I interviewed the CEO of Showfields, Tal Zvi. But in this article from Fashion United, Amir Zwickel, who's their co-founder, is talking about opening the new store in Miami. So a formal announcement, Showfields opening a second store. And by the way, late breaking news or quick breaking news or exclusive news, Tal will be making the journey to Toronto and will be on the main stage kicking off day 2 of Store. I'll have the great pleasure of interviewing Tal on the stage as he tells Canada here in Toronto in the summer all about his all about the store and about the vision in person. So your chance to meet and hear from Tal in person at Store. Get your tickets and find out more on storeconference.ca. Kohl's laying off 250 workers as part of restructuring. No surprise there. A bit of a reckoning coming for Kohl's. We've talked about that. New CEO for IKEA Global eyes even more affordable furniture as retail landscape shift. That's again from the Globe and Mail. I didn't realize how many Globe and Mail articles I put in. And speaking of that, IKEA Canada CEO and Chief Sustainability Officer Michael Ward to be live on the stage at Store 2020. We just announced, Retail Council just announced a big part of their roster store speakers. It's going to be a great, fantastic show this year. So look forward to that. L Brands, here's something new. A little more, it feels like a little more stronger than a rumor. Typically, I don't put trade rumors or buy rumors in retail this week, but from CNBC, L Brands nears sale of Victoria's Secret to Sycamore Partners, which is certainly an interesting turn of events, and it does feel after some tremendously bad news and weaker than expected results for Victoria's Secret that something's going to have to happen, and this might be it. Speaking of not great news, Bed Bath & Beyond shares plunge after surprise Q4 sales. New CEO there a couple of weeks ago, I reported how he had cleared house basically, and now now they even announcing the results were even worse. So the market reacting to that, thinking that the worst is over, but turns out not quite the case. Independent retailers, Superette is opening more stores in Ottawa and two planned for Toronto. So you can hear, by the way, Lauren Davey. I interviewed Lauren Davey a couple of episodes ago. A fantastic episode with Lauren, who's now been promoted from director to VP retail sales at Superette. And coming up in March, I'll actually be interviewing Mimi Lam, one of the co-founders and CEO of Superette. And we'll be doing that live in her new location on Yonge Street. So wait and tune in for that. From Forbes, how indie bookstores beat Amazon at the book-selling game. I actually think I put an article in similar to this before. I think I put the link to the article in the Harvard Business Review. This is an article about the article from Forbes, but I thought it added some value. Let's see what else we've got. Moving on to digital, you've got Glossier, and a good backstory here from Wired, actually Wired UK, on how Glossier turned itself into a billion-dollar brand. Mall owner buys Taubman Centers in $3.6 million deal. SoftBank backed, brandless, shuts the door. So SoftBank, another bit of embarrassment after what's going on with WeWork. So we wish everyone well there, but certainly lots of news around SoftBank. Well, that's a wrap on this edition of The Voice of Retail. If you like the podcast, you can subscribe on Apple iTunes, your favorite podcast platform. Please rate and review, and be sure to recommend to a friend or colleague in the retail industry. I'm Michael LeBlanc, founder and president of Emmy LeBlanc Company, Inc., and you can learn more about me on www.emmyleblanc.co or, of course, on LinkedIn. Until next time, have a great week.